I mean, that Madison Square Garden joke, again,
Right.
horrible joke. That was such a battering ram that the media was using to just drive a stake through his political heart. And I think it had the ultimate reverse effect.
Michael Smerconish is the host of the Michael Smerconish program on SiriusXM's POTUS channel. He's also the host of Smerconish on CNN. Michael, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
So you just came from an interview with Kevin Costner.
It's pretty wild, right?
It was great. Yeah, how did that go?
It went well, I thought, and it was really funny because he had invited me to attend a screening last night of Chapter 2 of his Horizon, he hopes, 4-part series. And he said, come to a screening, there are only going to be 20 people there on a Sunday night. And I said to him, well, presumably you're staying overnight into Monday, so no quid pro quo, but come on radio, I'd love to have you. And he said, okay, I'm in. So we did it in the SiriusXM, we call it Fishbowl space, which is a performance space. We were able to involve 30 or 40 listeners, and it was just wonderful. What I did not recognize when he invited me to the screening and then I invited him to the radio interview is that last night would be Yellowstone. So I got off a train at Madison Square Garden at Penn Station, and I looked up and there was this, billboard style advertising for Yellowstone kicking off that season. And that's when I said to myself, holy shit, he's going to be with me the morning after. And already the speculation was that Governor Dutton, if you watch the show, and I'm sure you do, was going to be killed off. So the timing worked out really well.
Yeah. Now, you're visiting New York.
Yeah.
You live in Philadelphia.
I do, yeah.
Obviously, beyond the fact that it's convenient to live there because to work there and to host your shows from there because you live there. Do you see advantages of not living in New York, where most of the media industry resides?
I do. Yeah. I like to be removed. I think that it probably influences my story selection. I know that it influences my perspective of the world, and I think it probably keeps me a bit detached from the media bubble, and I do appreciate that.
Let's get into the media bubble a little bit.
Yeah.
And I want to talk about your broader thoughts about the media, but
Sure.
Obviously I think we should probably start with the election
of
Donald Trump last week. You have an interesting perspective on this because you served in a Republican administration a couple decades ago. You cut your teeth in talk radio. You eventually ditched the GOP to become a proud independent and a champion of moderation. What's your big takeaway from this election and what it says about America? And forgive me for the broad question.
Yeah, no, that's okay, because I've had to think a lot about it. So I don't want it all distilled into this one soundbite or conclusion, but at the top of my list, I'll say it that way, the more, it's like a parenting lesson, the more that you tell people what they can't do, what's intolerable, you must not do this, you should not do this, the more they're going to rebel. Maybe they would have ultimately come to their own conclusion and rejected Donald Trump. I don't know. But I think that the constant browbeating and the combination of the media influence and the 4 indictments, 1 conviction, and showing, that god-awful joke from Madison Square Garden a week in advance of the election on a loop, and I felt it and I said it. I can't sit here, Aidan, telling you, well, this is the way I called the election, but I definitely felt the potential for a boomerang effect. And I think that came true. I really do.
That's really my biggest takeaway from the election, is that this is a major repudiation of the media, as far as I see it, because media spent the vast majority of the media has spent nearly a decade now warning about Trump. He goes on to secure his biggest electoral victory of his life. And that was after he went through 2 impeachments, trying to overturn the 2020 election, January 6th. The criminal indictments and what was a fairly extreme campaign,
right?
Just in terms of what where our Overton window is in American politics. Do you see this as a repudiation of the media, the American people basically saying we don't care about the way you've covered this guy and the way that you've described him?
In part, yes, but I would be more broad focused than that. Not just the media, but a rejection of any number of institutions. And by the way, nothing of what I'm saying is meant in defense of Trump's underlying conduct. Mm-hmm. I believed that the hush money payment case should never have been brought. the legal gymnastics that had to be undertaken in order for that to get beyond the statute of limitations, I thought was very telling. That was the first of the indictments to be brought. I think that it poisoned the water and fueled the perception that this really was largely political. And I think it just diluted everything that came after it. I always thought that the cleanest case, the most egregious case, was the Mar-a-Lago document case, just because they had the combination of the video from the closed circuit system at Mar-a-Lago and also all the text messages. If you didn't have a legal justification, Presidential Records Act or some such thing, and the case got to a jury, I thought it was pretty darn straightforward. But by the time you got to that case, you had to go through the actual trial of the hush money payment case. And I think it really just impacted everybody's thinking.
Right, and I think, it's no coincidence that his approvals numbers surged after he was indicted in that case.
True.
Now, you had a great monologue on your CNN show this week about Trump's victory. You asked the question, has Donald Trump changed America or revealed it?
Yeah.
Which was inspired by, I think it was the Carlos Lozada.
Which I thought was fabulous.
He's a great writer.
Yeah.
In the New York Times. Tell us what you mean by that, about this idea that has Donald Trump changed America or revealed it?
So in the commentary, and thank you for watching it, I dropped in, it's funny in the Trump era how we read so much, we watch so much, but there are certain things that hang with you. And one of the things that has always hung with me was Michael Wolff was like the first of the Trump book tellers, right? He's the one who set up shop, I guess, on a sofa in the West Wing at Steve Bannon's invitation. And he writes this book, Fire and Fury, and it's chock full of different anecdotes. But one of them that hung with me is he tells a story about Donald Trump in the heyday of Atlantic City, if there was one. And Trump's on a private plane and a group of people, and I don't know if they're going from New York to Florida or some such thing, but Atlantic City is not in the plan. And Trump proposes a detour that they land in Atlantic City. Somebody else on board says, Atlantic City, that's for white trash. And then a foreign model who's not identified says, what is white trash? And Trump says, they're people like me except they're poor. And I've always had that in my head because he's, long before he ran for office, he's associated himself with working class people. And then you fast forward to last spring, he was never going to win New Jersey, but he did an event in Wildwood with 100,000 people. And there's this iconic, I think, image of Trump with a Ferris wheel behind him. And I always just looked at that as the embodiment of Trump and populism that was never fully understood, comprehended by the media. And the media then became somewhat scolding as we got closer to the election of fascist dictator. If he's a fascist dictator and somebody who's working class, supportive of him, is going to be voting for him, what are you telling them? And then when President Biden said that they're garbage, it just brought it all home. Yeah. So I just think that electorate was so disrespected that there was no way they were going to be told for whom they were going to vote, and they probably came out more so than they might have if they hadn't had all those forces telling them what to do.
Were you surprised by the results at all? I think we were a little bit different from 2016, where the media, I think, was really taken by surprise. This time around, I think there was a certain amount of, I think people to a certain extent thought Trump can't possibly win after all that's happened, and that probably blunted some of the analysis of the polls, which showed that he was probably the favorite. But were you surprised at all by the success?
I was surprised that he broke 50%.
Right.
I was really surprised by him winning the popular vote because I am one of those people who would often say on radio or television that he has a high floor and a low ceiling. And 2016 versus 2020, 2016 had a very robust third party, Gary Johnson, Bill Weld as Libertarian candidates movement that never materialized in this cycle. So where the hell was he going to make it up? Like, how was he ever going to get to 48, much less, 50? And he did. So I was really taken aback by the breadth of the victory. That he won, is that so jaw-dropping? No. But that he won the popular vote, huge.
Yeah, because, and you noted this on your show, Gallup, he never broke 49% in the Gallup polls during his administration.
Right. I think it was a 41% approval rating
average. Average. So he's never been a particularly popular political figure.
Yeah.
In fact, he's probably, at least in modern American political history, pretty low down on the list in terms of popularity. How do you explain how he managed to get more than 50% of the vote?
So two things. One, some element of begrudging respect, meaning that reluctant Trump voters, the people who say and mean, I really don't like the guy. Ultimately, he earned some begrudging respect from them because he's the Energizer Bunny. Yeah. You know, he just kept coming back and coming back and coming back. I think about I guess it was spring, early summer, when he was on trial here, and, you know, the motorcade would go. I walked by Trump Tower last night, so I have this in my head. But, you know, you'd see him and he'd exit and he'd go down and he'd sit there in court all day long, and then he couldn't say anything, but he'd walk out and he would quote media sources and so forth. So I think that was a large part of it. I think that in the end, people had to give him props at some level for coming back from the dead in all of this.
Yeah.
That would be at the top of the list. And then I think that the disconnect between Democrats and the media on some of the cultural issues is largely the explanation for why he was able, or how he was able to win.
Right. And I also think, you know, at the risk of being too simplistic about it, there's also just the fact that the Biden administration had a 30% approval rating.
Right.
The 70%, 65 to 70% of the country of Americans thought the country was on the wrong track. And then just high prices. You know, that's something that is hard for incumbents to overcome.
I agree with that.
It might very well be the case that any Democrat you put up against Trump that was facing those headwinds would have lost.
I agree with that, and I would add immigration to that list.
Right.
You know, the combination of the economy, the low approval rating for President Biden, factor in now immigration. And it makes logical sense when you look back at it. But then again, you say, but it's Trump. Can he really get beyond? I mean, I think he was at 46.1 and then 46.8 in 2016. And then, so I always questioned if he could ever get to 48%. The fact that he got to 50% was really significant. And one other thing, if I can say, just on this whole aspect of the disrespect, I live in the Philadelphia suburbs. I've spent my whole life in a 50-mile radius, the city of Philadelphia, and then those collar burbs that get so much attention. There was a particular yard sign in the Philly burbs, and I know in other similar communities, which said Harris Walls, obviously. Or as I would say on radio, Harris Walls, obviously. I mean, it's like past the gray poupon. I thought it was just, if you remember the commercial, I just thought that it was said with such condescension. Like, of course, we're Harris Walls people. You don't think we're like those Trump people who go to Wildwood.
You're an idiot if you're not.
Right. And when I saw that yard sign, I talked about it immediately on air, and I said that if people who are inclined to vote for Donald Trump should see that, they're going to get pissed, and then they're really going to vote for Donald Trump.
You also spoke about how men were the key to Trump's success.
Right.
And I think that plays into that a little bit, particularly given how much he relied on new media, on the podcast world, which is heavily male-dominated in talent and in audience. Explain that to us. How do you think he was so successful with young men?
I think that, I don't know if you want to call it dominant media, legacy media, whatever the term that we're using for old school conventional media, which includes the big three cable outlets and the networks and so forth. It's a fragmented world. We all watch different things. You know, I have sons who are in their 20s who tell me about different media platforms that I've never heard of. Like, they're my lifeline to make sure that I'm somewhat conversant in these things. And I think that Trump was very wise in doing narrowcasting, especially to young men. And although that 18 to 29 demo is one that he lost, he was able to boost himself so much with young men. And I think it's as a result of him doing the kind of outreach that he did. Scott Galloway, who was one of my favorite television and radio guests, he and I have spoken about the plight of young men, something that I really believe in. I remember in the summer when the DNC was meeting, and on television I was able to put on the screen a page from the platform, and it said, here is who we represent. This was like, you know, Democrats.org, or whatever the official website was, and every constituency you could imagine was represented, including women, except men. And Galloway and I talked about it, you know, 6 months ago, like, hey, this is so indicative of how no one wants to go after this electorate. And then, of course, if you go after that electorate, you've got critics who say, oh, you know, you're pursuing toxic masculinity. And Scott, his response is, no, there's aspirational masculinity of recognizing that our guys today are lagging behind our young women, and someone needs to be their champion. And he pursued that.
There is a lot of, I think, reflection now about how the media covers Trump,
Right.
which was a recurring and sometimes tedious subject during the first Trump term. Now, I think a lot of people are going to be rethinking the way that they cover Trump in a second term. How do you think broadly the media should cover Trump? And do you think it'll learn from its mistakes in the past?
So I remember well what went on in 2016. That was my first CNN cycle. And I remember that people would be very critical of the network, and they would say, you give him so much time. And my defense at the time was to say, hey, if you're walking through your living room, this is at a time when I and many others thought this is never going to last. I mean, at some point, this is going to run its course, right? And she's going to beat him. But I would say to people, if you're walking through your living room and Donald Trump's on the television or Hillary Clinton is on the television, for which are you stopping to watch? And they say, well, Trump. And then I would say, well, then don't blame Jeff Zucker for putting it on a loop, you know? And then I think there was soul searching after he was elected, and there was sort of this consensus that he'd been given too much free media. Okay, I understand that as well. But then I think the other extreme became one of covering only the negativity and jumping. I mean, that Madison Square Garden joke, again, horrible joke. He should have come out, Trump, and at the outset, if they recognized what a problem it was and if he'd heard it or someone told him about it, he should have condemned the joke and then moved forward, because it was a beautifully staged event otherwise. But we were now in the final 10 days of the election, and that joke dominated for Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And I would hear from radio callers who would say, like, you know, enough already. Let's get back and talk about the issues. But that was such a battering ram that the media was using to just drive a stake through his political heart. And I think it had the ultimate reverse effect.
Reverse effect, as these things seem to do
So
regularly.
The answer to your question is somewhere in between. And I don't claim that I'm pitch perfect, but I think that the approach that I try to take on radio and on television, which is to be critical of him when he deserves it, which is often, but also to back off and understand some of the issues that give him resonance. Wherever that happy medium is, that's where I want to be, and that's where I think the media should be.
Does Trump being at the center of U.S. politics in the position of president, does it make it hard to be moderate, to maintain that stance? Or
well, for me, what it means is that I'm just going to incur the wrath of everybody. One of the highest compliments that was ever paid to me was I had done Bill Maher's show, and after there's like a quick meet and greet and you have a cocktail and so forth. And he came up to me and he said to me, you don't have a team. He said, I don't have a team. You don't have a team. He said, I like that I don't have a team and you don't have a team. We had this conversation about it, that we didn't have this like built-in natural constituency. And my answer to him was, well, yeah, don't forget though, most of the country is like us, right? Probably fiscally conservative and socially more progressive. The fact that the talking heads and the politicians, which is this whole symbiotic relationship that's not in the country's best interest, the fact that they don't have teams, don't mistake that for the rest of the country not feeling somewhere in between.
What do you think this means for the future of the media? Because there's obviously a lot of coverage right now about how this was the podcast election, this was the new media election. And I think we do seem to be entering a phase where the legacy media, let's call it, is less powerful than ever before. And new media, independent media, let's call it, is dominant. Do you see that? And does it concern you?
Yes, I see it, and yes, it concerns me because the television work that I do is tied to one of those dominant media outlets that I still believe in. You know, I'm old school. When there's something of a global significance that takes place, I'm immediately on CNN because I continue to believe that the network has this unparalleled footprint that is global. I remember during COVID, we have a second home, and during COVID, our daughter and son-in-law moved out of New York City and into this second home of ours, and they became like squatters. We had to get rid of them ultimately, but when they finally left, I remember turning on the television, and I'm like, what the hell? I can't get CNN. They had cut the cord. They had cut the cord on my cable
in your own
bill.
home.
In my own home, in my own second home, yes, but in my own home. But I have to say that was quite a wake-up call because they are young 30-somethings and they don't watch what I watch. So yeah, I think that the dust has got to settle. I don't think it's going back to where it was. but I'm not sure who's going to be left standing.
Yeah.
In terms of the podcast world. I mean, we're still at a stage where it seems like everybody has a podcast. I'm responsible for 3 of them. So I get it.
You said in 2018 during Trump's first term, I worry that he's been effective in diminishing the credibility of the media among his constituents. And that's something that's only gotten worse.
For sure.
Particularly with now the addition of figures like Elon Musk, who has this enormous platform, which he pretty much uses as a battering ram against the media. Is there a way to fight back against that? Is that something that you think is going to get worse during a second Trump term? How do you see that?
First of all, the first thing I want to say is that Elon Musk is the media, right? Like he's now become the media, and I paid close attention to X in the waning days of the campaign, and it sure seemed to me that he dominated his own platform with his message. Like every time I would go online, it was Musk who was at the top of the list and so forth. I think that what has to happen is that the media needs to earn back some credibility. And the way to earn back credibility is to be an equal opportunity offender and to be critical of the left and to be critical of the right, be critical of Donald Trump when he deserves it, but not to make it your mainstay of existence. Yeah. You're only going to help him.
The issue, I think, that a lot of, and the trap that a lot of the media falls into is that Americans, whenever they're polled, they always say that they want nonpartisan news.
Right.
But they don't watch it very much. When it comes to the stuff that rates well, typically in cable news, is partisan opinion. Is that a challenge for the media, that there is a very seductive appeal among viewers to pushing out partisan opinion?
I think it's the easy way out. How much easier my job would be, how much less I would have to work if I were one of the ideologues. God, that must be great, to get out of bed and to literally be provided talking points on the left or the right, do no investigation, no exploration of nuance, and simply adhere to whatever the MSNBC mantra of the day might be, or the Fox News mantra of the day. That's not where my head is, and that's not what I choose to do with my time. So here's the shortcoming, because you've properly assessed the media world in which we live, which is all polarized, but I think it's also lazy on the part of a lot of programmers who believe that there's nobody out there who can bring it and be in the middle. And believe me, there are 100 more just like me, but they need to be shown, and they're like rising talent. They need to be shown, hey, you don't have to be an ideologue, you can be yourself, but have some personality. Unfortunately, we've come to associate independence or moderation with boredom, and that just is not the case. It's not the case.
You can still be compelling, but moderate.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I don't know why this narrative has taken hold that it's all vanilla, and with some bullshit old line about you get run over in the middle of the. What are you talking about?
Mark Thompson is running CNN now, and he is tasked with basically taking the network into the future, because obviously the linear model has been very profitable for CNN for years is in decline, and there is a pretty urgent need to develop a digital future, which he seems to be quite focused on. Are you confident that he will be able to do that at CNN?
So you're more knowledgeable about these affairs than I am. I truly know about the inner workings of CNN, what I read in Mediaite. I'm just not connected. I'm not on the 9 o'clock call. I don't have the email. I don't get the memos. And I'm not saying that.
Is that deliberate? You're happy to have an arm's length?
I'm not saying that in a disparaging way at all. I'm very proud of my association and affiliation. I just don't want anybody to think that I'm in the know, because I'm not in the know. So my fingers are crossed. He strikes me as a very bright guy. I mean, he ran the BBC, he ran the New York Times. I think we're fortunate to have him at CNN. And I think, I don't understand, here, this will prove my naivete, I don't understand what happened where the digital platform that Jeff was building got unplugged, and then the dust clears, and like, hey, here's our new digital. And if you asked me to differentiate what was intended from what we've now created, I have no idea. I just pray that it's successful. I think it's a necessary component. I know that in my own world, managing, both a Sirius XM radio program and a CNN show, and having a website, and having my passion project, which is my daily newsletter, of which I'm so damn proud. You gotta be doing all these different things, right? Yeah. You've gotta have a successful digital footprint, and I look at the success of the New York Times in that regard, why shouldn't it be CNN? I think that the elements are there for success.
You also, and I think this conversation has led to this, you also have the Mingle project.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting idea for these times. Could you tell us about that?
So the Mingle, well, I'll explain it this way. I do a lot of public speaking. I speak to private groups, I speak to public groups, usually comprised of radio listeners or television viewers. I enjoy being on the road and I enjoy speaking to live audiences. And at any particular time, I'm delivering one set of remarks that sums up the times, at least according to me. But for the last 9 months or so, I've been on the road and hosting radio guests and so forth, all under this umbrella of what I describe as the Mingle Project, which is my attempt to diagnose and prescribe for the disconnect of our society, that which has frayed our political fabric, driven us in separate directions, and I think harmed the mental health of our kids. And I had an epiphany moment. I interview lots of authors on my radio program, and I had an epiphany moment after I'd interviewed Bill Bishop on The Big Sort, and Gene Twangy on iGen, and Jonathan Haidt on The Anxious Generation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I started to see all these books as telling, and the political science as telling, a similar story about Charles Murray coming apart, about how in the internet age, we've connected, largely younger Americans have connected, but in a very impersonal way, while we've seen a spike in polarization, and while we've also seen a spike in all of these really horrific mental health metrics. And I think that the reason is that we're not having enough communal experience. We're no longer the joiners that our parents and our grandparents were. And I'm out there really as an advocate saying it's time to re-engage as a society, step away briefly from the electronics. I'm not a Luddite, okay? I used Uber to get to your studio today. I'm gonna use OpenTable to find a dinner reservation tonight. But too much time online, not healthy for us, and the data all supports that.
Yeah. You've blamed polarized media as well for how we got where we are.
Yeah.
And in particular, and I very much agree with this, but the rise of partisan talk radio,
Yep.
which really started with the syndication of Rush Limbaugh in the 90s. Is that a good way to explain not just polarization, but the rise and endurance of Donald Trump?
Yes, because he was the first embodiment of a talk radio figure.
Yeah.
You know, and by the way, did not come out of the gate with the support of the talk radio community, because those traditional conservative talkers, they were all, dismissive of him.
He was an apostate too.
Absolutely. Yeah. But they all came around when they realized like he was the guy. This is part of a much longer and important conversation, but the short version is that when I came of age 3 decades ago in Philadelphia on what was then a flamethrower of a radio station, 50,000 watts of power, but typical of big talk market all across the country, every one of the hosts was a local host. They were all characters. The only glue that held them together was not ideological, it was that they could make the phones ring. Okay, we had a libertarian, we had a conservative, we had a liberal in the primetime lineup. We also had a sex show, we had a travel show, we had a food show, and it, we were judged, the metric by which we were judged was just being able to be conversant, share some expertise if you had any, and entertain the callers. It was pre the age of ideology. But let's be fair, AM was dying. I mean, look at them now. They're looking for a life raft from the Congress. Of all things, they want to be bailed out by the Congress. And because of the gravitation toward FM where there was no static, like here came Rush and he was the savior. And Rush was a great entertainer. He was, his fodder was politics, but at his core, he was a great, masterful entertainer. And overnight, I saw it flip, and now every station, including mine, wanted to have Rush and a stable of his imitators. And that became now 96. Fox News comes online. They take a page out of the talk radio handbook. MSNBC struggled. Phil Donahue was their first host of any stature. They couldn't make it work until they replicated on the left what he was doing on the right. So it breathed new life into this whole ecosystem. And like Donald Trump was out there, biding his time, threatening to run. And when he finally made his move, I think Republican voters were ready to vote for someone who reminded them of their favorite talk radio host. That was Trump.
And I think now social media has basically filled a lot of that void. If and podcasts as well. If people aren't listening to talk radio anymore, they're watching the Daily Wire podcasts or Joe Rogan,
for sure,
or they're on Twitter. How much do you think the environment, the information environment fueled by Elon Musk on Twitter, contributed to Trump's win?
Hugely. I think it was a very big factor. Maybe a combination of Musk and what I'm reading, Barron Trump, giving his father advice in terms of where he should go and spend his time, because it's hard to understand the lay of the land, right? It's when there's so much competition out there. As I say, I just don't know how much of it is going to last, because the market share is just not big enough for all the sources that we have.
Now, there's been a lot of prognosticating about what a second Trump term would look like.
Mm-hmm.
I had Piers Morgan on this show last week, and he said that he thought Trump would govern as a moderate with his legacy in mind. And the week before that, I had Ann Applebaum of The Atlantic on, and
she said... Two good guests.
Thank you. She predicted that he would govern like an autocrat, similar to the ones that she's covered in her career in Europe. What do you think? If I can get you to put on your prediction hat, how do you think Trump is going to govern in a second term?
I'm going right down the alley that I was in 2016, and perhaps making the same mistake, okay? But I acknowledge it. So what I said was, after 2016, which I did not see coming, I said, come on, he's Studio 54 Trump. We know he doesn't, 2 Corinthians, he doesn't believe any of this stuff. Okay, but he then became more ideological, and I was surprised by how he governed. I would like to think, as Piers does, I think I'm closer to Piers than I am to Ann Applebaum in thinking that he is now thinking toward how does it all look in the books when it's over. What belies some of that thinking are the people that he's already naming, to move around him. But I don't know that Susie Wiles will allow him to go down the extremist road. Maybe this is wishful thinking on my part. I hope that he's not doctrinaire. And I hope that he's not ideological. He's the least ideological president of my lifetime. I've been paying close attention since 1980 with Reagan's initial election. He's all transactional. It's all transactional. So I'm hoping it will be transactional Trump, not tethered to very extreme politics. Have me back in 4 years and say, man, did you blow that? Because he was the same Trump that we elected the first time around. And I'll sit here and I'll eat crow.
Michael Smerconish, thanks for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Okay.